Good evening. I'm making sure that everything is right on the other end. Are we good? I think so. There she is. Okay. Okay. Good evening, everybody. We're so thankful to all of you who chose to join us this evening. I'm Dr. Jocelyn Evans. I'm the Associate Dean in the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities at the University of West Florida. The Downtown Lecture Series is a hallmark activity of UWF. Historically, we've gathered together in the Museum of Commerce, the Artel Art Gallery, the Pensacola Museum of Art, but during the pandemic, we've erred on the side of caution, holding our events virtually until it's safe for our community to meet together in person again. Fortunately, we see this period soon coming to an end. At the end of the event tonight, I'm going to take a few moments to highlight the plans we have for the spring in store for all of you. But we're so appreciative right now for this opportunity to share time with Dr. Allysha Winburn. She received her bachelor's degree in archaeological studies from Yale, her master's degree in anthropology from NYU, and a doctorate in anthropology from the University of Florida. She's currently an assistant professor of anthropology here at UWF. We are so blessed to have her. She is a diplomate of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology, a biological anthropologist with forensic and bioarchaeological expertise. Her research focuses on skeletal aging and age estimation and the ritual use of human remains. In addition to her work in academia, she's served multiple roles in the field as a forensic anthropologist. Currently, she is a consulting forensic anthropologist for the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences and Florida's District 1 Medical Examiner's Office. Previously, she was a forensic anthropologist for the Department of Navy Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command, or JPAC. She was a forensic anthropology analyst at the University of Florida's C.A. Pound Human Identification Laboratory and forensic technician with the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner, Emergency Recovery of World Trade Center Remains Operation. Tonight, for all of those of you who love CSI and bones and all of it, she pulls back the curtain a little bit and shows us the reality of her job in forensic science unearthed, exploring crime scene and laboratory casework with a UWF forensic anthropologist. Dr. Winburn, thank you for joining us.
I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you for the lovely intro. This is the UWF Forensic Field Recovery Field School, and I'm a practicing forensic anthropologist. Forensic anthropology is just the application of biological anthropology knowledge to questions of medico-legal significance, typically who somebody was and how they died. And so in the medico-legal context in the United States is the coroner and medical examiner system, the death investigation system. But we also have to have a set of field recovery skills that are analogous to what archaeologists have. And so when we process a crime scene, we are processing a crime scene like an archaeological site.
I believe we are the only 5-week field school in the nation right now. All other programs in forensic anthropology are typically only 1 week. But UWF has such an amazing focus on archaeological field methods that ours is able to be 5 weeks long.
And so what you're seeing here is sort of the culmination of their whole summer of training, where not only are they surveying, mapping, and documenting, but they're also doing subsurface excavations. And they first had to identify clandestine grave sites. Of course, these are mock sites that, that my graduate students dug.
We placed plastic skeletons into the ground. We buried them as if we were in the shoes of a perpetrator. So we did it quick and dirty, as if it were in the middle of the night or something along those lines. And ironically enough, while we were back here digging these skeletons, the UWF Police Department came upon us and came out to investigate to see what we were doing. So that was very interesting. And we were all standing there with our shovels like, we promised we're supposed to be here.
They have just created these very realistic scenarios. So there are some individuals that look like they've been buried ritualistically.
Others were had ligatures, so they were bound to their wrists. We had others that had shell casings or other material evidence within the dirt nearby, so the students had to screen through to try to find that additional evidence with the burials.
The scenarios that we have tried to create for the students really do approximate what they might see in a forensic recovery context.
So we dug the graves 3 weeks beforehand so that they would give the time for the dirt to settle, everything to look a little bit more natural. And then we had them start up at the road, and they did a pedestrian line search where you're spread out, arm to arm with everybody in the field school, and then we just systematically walked the entire forest.
And then you're looking for things that look suspicious, like this was a possible site because it's a depression. So depressions, mounds, and like discoloration of the forest ground was mainly what we were looking for. And then obviously any material evidence, like we found a hat, we found a sign, found some duct tape. Those things were also flagged and GPS located.
And then that is when we decided to break up into our groups and split up the work and start excavating to see what was down there.
So you go down like 10 centimeters at a time and expose the bone, photograph it, map it.
And they're using a technique called pedestaling, which is very, very carefully carving with wooden or plastic tools all of the sediments away from the sides of a bone so that you can draw a map of it, take a photograph of it, but it isn't going anywhere. Because the context of, for example, an item of material evidence and an individual's body is really important. Duct tape is meaningful if you find it in the screens, but it's more meaningful if you find it intact around a decedent's wrists. So preserving that context as they are excavating and preserving the remains and the material evidence in situ, in place, is really, really important. And that's a skill that they'll take away from this course.
So I actually have an upcoming job with the medical examiner's office. So I'll be one of the forensic techs. It's a really rewarding experience, and it will give me really good experience for going into a master's program later on.
But that's why the forensic field recovery program here is really important, because I want to produce a generation of forensic anthropologists that actually has field recovery chops.
So our students are really able to come out of here with a fantastic, strong foundation for moving on to either forensics, archaeology, or both, or basically anything in anthropology that they want to pursue after this.
Okay. I wanted to begin with that fantastic field school video that our institutional communications folks put together for us this summer for a couple of reasons. Number one, I love the community engagement vibe of this lecture series. And to me, that field school, of course, it's a course, but I see it as community service almost more than an academic offering, because I am creating my own fellow colleagues. I am serving the forensic anthropology community by training a new generation of forensic anthropologists. I'm also serving the Pensacola community because, as that video highlights, the skills that my field students acquire during the forensic anthropology field school are directly translatable into being a law enforcement officer, being a CSI tech. It's not just archaeology, it's not just anthropology. And we do place people directly out of that field school into positions, for example, at our local medical examiner's office. And so I think our Pensacola community already has such a great understanding of our archaeological engagement at UWF. And with this field school this past year, where we had 23 students, the biggest group ever, I just want to stake my claim and say UWF forensic anthropology is on the map as well. And I also wanted to highlight the contribution of my students, who are really the stars of that video. I think a lot of what I talk about tonight is also going to make more sense now that you have seen, just in a nice, clean 5-minute snippet, exactly what the nature of forensic field recovery entails. So I'm just going to begin by talking a little bit about what forensic anthropology is and what it isn't. Then I'll talk specifically about field recoveries, and then we'll pivot and we'll do sort of a deep dive into one particular context of forensic casework, which is in the historic POW and MIA recovery mission. So forensic anthropology just means the application of anthropology to the medico-legal setting. Medico-legal being the law enforcement, death investigation, and judicial system. And so the medical part of that is doing autopsies, doing death investigations, figuring out who a decedent is and how they died. And then the legal part of that, of course, takes over if there has indeed been a crime committed. And so forensic anthropologists are really just bioanthropologists. Bioanthropologists are people who are experts in human skeletal and dental variation, and they can parlay that knowledge of human anatomy into essentially telling stories about the dead. So you can have that same skill set and you can be, for example, a paleoanthropologist. You can be a bioarchaeologist. But if you choose to specialize in parlaying that knowledge into answering questions of medico-legal significance, then you're a forensic anthropologist. And typically those questions that we answer are, number one, what is a decedent's identity? And number two, what are the circumstances surrounding their death? And so you may think of sort of the traditional milieu of a forensic anthropologist as being in the lab, measuring skulls, measuring bones. And indeed, that is what we do, but that is only part of what we do. And I think you'll enjoy exploring this fascinating career path with me today. So in the lab, when we're wearing our lab scientist coat, actually, to be more accurate, when we're wearing our lab coat, we are doing kind of one of two things. We are either answering that question of identity or we're answering that question of circumstances of death. And in order to answer questions of identity, we may put together what's called the biological profile. And this is essentially a skeletal snapshot of how a person might have appeared during their life in terms of their age at death, their sex, and so on. And that biological profile is not an identification in and of itself, but it allows us to pare down the universe of possible missing unknown persons to a smaller, more manageable, perhaps local group of people that we can really target for case resolution. Now, the other side of our lab analyses is trauma, circumstances of death. Because should our trauma analysis inform a medical examiner that the manner of death was homicide, then that triggers a whole different series of procedures and protocols. And so the analysis of skeletal trauma is, in some cases, the most important thing that we do in order to advance case resolution. And you can see here an example of a cast decedent with gunshot trauma. I'll actually pause there for a moment and just highlight, for those of you that maybe started a little bit late, if you joined us late, all of the remains that you saw in the field school video at the beginning were also cast material. Everything that you're going to see in today's lecture is cast material, meaning it's a replica, it's an educational model. And I do that because I think that many people in my field are moving away from the display of actual human remains towards a practice that we feel is more ethical. So this is a cast, a replica of someone with a gunshot entrance wound there above the left orbit and an exit wound back on the left aspect of the occipital. And so not only are we experts in skeletal human variation, but we're also experts in how different implements impact bone. So gunshot trauma is going to look very different from blunt trauma, which is going to look very different from trauma from a knife or a saw or a machete. And so our knowledge of how those different implements impact bone, potentially the sequence in which they impact bone, what that says in terms of a perpetrator potentially targeting portions of a decedent to be dismembered or taken apart. All of those things can really inform a medical examiner's determination of cause and manner of death, with cause of death being the very precise medical diagnosis of death, and manner really only having 5 options. So manner of death can be suicide, accident, homicide, natural, or undetermined. And of course, it is the cases of homicide, which get particular attention from law enforcement and then the judicial system. And so the word forensic in front of my job title really just means I'm an anthropologist that applies my skill set to that medical legal system, to that forensic system of death investigation. And that is kind of the classic scenario in which forensic anthropologists work. They may consult for one or more medical examiner or coroner departments. Depending on where you live in the United States, you might have a coroner system or a medical examiner system. But either way, that is a system of death investigation. Whenever there is a death in this country that is unexpected, sometimes termed unattended, then that means it's a death that has to be investigated in the medical examiner system. If, for example, it is someone who is a terminal cancer patient who dies in hospice under the care of their physician, that would be considered an attended death. That would probably not need to be investigated in the medical legal system. But if the circumstances surrounding that death are suspicious, not only for homicide, but for infectious disease, for, in the case of a motor vehicle accident, who is at fault? Was it a malfunction? Was it human error? So whenever there are these questions about cause and manner of death, those are the deaths that get investigated in this system. And those are the deaths to which we forensic anthropologists contribute. Now, we are not in charge of the medical examiner system. The medical examiners are, of course, the pathologists, medical doctors who are highly specialized in conducting autopsies, looking at histological slides of particular pathological conditions, and weighing in on the disease processes or the traumatic processes that impacted a person's body and ultimately contributed to their death. But should that medical examiner, that autopsy specialist, need a bone specialist, that's when we come in. So in cases of trauma, in cases where people are decomposed to the point where an autopsy is not practical or viable, in places where people are completely skeletonized, and identification through normal visual or fingerprinting means is not possible, we may be called in those situations. In situations where there has been burning, there has been a fire, even sometimes in cases of disputed cremated human remains. Whenever there is bone, hard tissue, or the need to look at trauma more closely, forensic anthropologists can contribute to that medical legal death investigation, typically in the form of reporting to the medical examiner or the coroner to inform their determinations. And so that's kind of where we got our start. But forensic anthropology today is so much more than just the medical examiner system. So some forensic anthropologists, like me, work in academia. Others work in human rights contexts. Still others work for the military. And so we're going to highlight some of those contexts in the examples that follow. But I want to kind of first start with the classic. What happens when there is a suspicious death? Well, if there is a crime scene in which remains are decomposed or skeletonized or buried in a clandestine grave, then local law enforcement agencies might call me to contribute to that crime scene investigation. And that is when all of those field protocols that were discussed in the opening video come into play. Because when I respond to a scene, I treat it like an archaeological site. Of course, I understand that the typical sort of liberties in terms of time, in terms of research, I can't do those. That's, it's not an archaeological site. And I'm not in charge. The medical examiner is in charge, or the detective is in charge. The state attorney may be present. So there are these time strictures, there are personnel strictures, but as much as I can, I try to modify archaeological protocols to fit the crime scene context. And so you could really kind of call what I do crime scene archaeology. So I would deploy to the field, not solo, by the way, to any of my grad students who are watching. I go into the field with my invaluable field technicians, my highly trained graduate students who are themselves accomplished field recovery experts in their own right. But we go into the field whenever we're needed. And so if there is a rule for when that is, it is always at the most inconvenient time. It's on Christmas, or it's, we did a recovery as COVID was outbreaking back in March 2020. And, as we're on site doing our recovery, someone looked at their phone and said, "Oh my gosh, we're locked down. The university is closing." So those are strictures as well. You know, I cannot expect my graduate personnel to turn out during a pandemic to assist me in the field. But I've never gone on a recovery without graduate assistance. And frankly, I couldn't, because having them there by my side really allows me, I mean, I have to be everywhere at once. I have to be interfacing with law enforcement. I have to be interfacing with the investigators from the medical examiner. I have to be doing the map. I have to be doing the excavation. So having a trained osteologist, a trained biological anthropologist there with me, I can say, you, ma'am, are in charge of the screens. I can have a trained osteologist at all times looking over all of the dirt that gets shaken through those shaker screens to make sure there is no items of evidence or tiny little bones that are being missed. And so you can see here in this image, this is our Go kit. We have this at the ready, and we have trowels there for doing hand excavations, clipboards for notes, dust pans for cleaning up the floor of an excavation, making it look nice for photography. There's a photo board in there. Of course, there's a first aid kit. We might need that. There's also a book that is used to chart soil color changes, because a good excavation of a crime scene, perhaps a clandestine burial, can actually preserve a lot about the circumstances that led to that decedent being deposited in that particular manner. And so in this hypothetical crime scene, one of my students is explaining to me the circumstances of this decedent's deposition, or how that decedent was placed into the ground. And you can see the way that they have excavated that grave. See the scalloped edge on the right-hand side? Those are shovel marks. So through a close and careful and systematic excavation of those sediments, by looking at soil color changes, by feeling for soil texture changes, they were able to excavate, not just get down there and get the body and get them out. Of course, that's important. Case resolution is important, but capturing all of those context clues as they go down is equally important. Now this forensic anthropologist can say, I know that grave was excavated with a spade-shaped shovel, because I see in the wall of the grave, I see the tool mark preserved. You can also see there that there is an archaeological provenience grid that has been emplaced atop the burial feature. Now, these things are wonderful. They're very, very helpful for us, because number one, they assist with mapping. That is a known quantity. Each one of those little squares is 1 by 1 by 1 by 1. But also each of those little squares allows us to structure the systematic way in which we undertake our excavation. Provenience essentially means the location of one item of evidence relative to another and relative to a known point on the landscape called a datum. And so the grid squares allow us to maintain horizontal provenience. I'm digging in grid 1, and anything that comes out, whether it's in my trowel or in the screens, is going to get bagged and tagged and labeled as grid 1. And then that can all sort of get put back together in the minds of jury members, in the minds of law enforcement, in the minds of your stakeholders. Because make no mistake about it, archaeology is destruction. Crime scene processing is destruction. You are never going to get the relationship between that decedent's hat and their knee and the mask back. Once you have taken that decedent out of the ground, that's gone. So you have to control the destruction. You have to photo document everything, and you have to map everything, and you have to be making a running log in your notes of everything that is going on, so that that crime scene can be put back together, metaphorically, of course, in the minds of your stakeholders, who are not themselves anthropologists or archaeologists. They are members of the lay public. And you need to make it very clear for them what you did, how you went about processing that crime scene, and the findings that resulted. And so you can see here, there's material evidence in situ or in place with that decedent. We would potentially have lost the relationship between that material evidence and the decedent if we had just kind of gone for gold and just went down there and pulled that decedent's remains out of the grave. And so doing a systematic archaeological recovery within the time constraints and the resource constraints of a crime scene is really, really important. And that's why I feel like more than any other course that I teach, when I teach field school, I am making junior colleagues. I am making field technicians. And I think that's a really important role. I mentioned maps. it's great to photo document a case. Absolutely, you should photo document a case. But a map can really enhance your stakeholders' understanding of that case. And so you can see here, one of my students is using the grid that they have established. And then they're also using tape measures to measure down to the locations of particular items of evidence, particular bones within that grave, so that what they are portraying when they submit their report is not just a skeleton in a hole, but the relationship of that cloth, for example, to the side of the skull, the fact that the decedent seems to have stopped when they hit that, or sorry, not the decedent, the perpetrator seems to have stopped when they hit that big root, because the rest of the grave goes deep, whereas the cranium is sort of balanced atop that large root. The items of clothing, is there evidence that a gun has been fired? All of those things would be mapped and plotted nicely into something that would look like this. So this is just a hand-drawn map. Of course, we use fancy tools as well. And I'd have a GPS point of the datum, of course. I might use a total station, which is an awesome surveying tool. I might use a total station to get a map of the surrounds, but really nothing replaces a measuring tape and a compass when you are creating a close plan view or overhead view of a clandestine grave or a surface scatter of human remains. And then this map would be taken back to the laboratory. It would be digitized using some sort of illustration software, so that it can actually be presented to your stakeholders very clean, very neat, and really highlighting all items of evidence very, very clearly. Because a photograph is all well and good, but a photograph does not highlight evidence. And so you can imagine a scenario in which, maybe the bones have been in the ground for some time, and maybe they've acquired sort of a brownish soil staining, and then you have roots, and then you have leaves. You can imagine a jury member saying, what am I looking at here? Which is the bone and which is the root? Are those bones? Is that a bone? Why are those leaves everywhere? So when you draw your map, you can label, this is a bone, this is a root. You can foreground items of evidence like remains, like material evidence, and you can background things like every leaf and every root, which do not need to be diagrammed, which do not need to be the focus of your map. And so to me, both photographs and maps really have to work in tandem. You have to present them together, because the map, that's your creation, that's your representation of reality. Photograph, a little bit cluttered, but closer to reality. And so with their powers combined, you have the map that portrays the evidence, and then the photograph that keeps it honest. So you can see that you have actually drawn to scale an illustration of what you saw in the ground. And then you remove it, and then you bag it, and you tag it, and you label it, and you transfer it to the agency in charge. And so when all is said and done, you produce a report, whether that is of a skeletal analysis, whether that is of a trauma analysis, whether that's of a field recovery, or in some cases, all of the above. Your stakeholders, law enforcement agencies, medical examiner agencies, your stakeholders receive a report that presents your findings to them in very, very clear, kind of jargon-free scientific writing. So these skills, archaeological field recovery, biological, anthropological knowledge of human anatomical variation, they are essential to forensic anthropology, however and wherever it's practiced. And so forensic anthropologists that do forensic anthropology 100%, that's the entirety of their job description, those are relatively rare, because not every law enforcement agency can hire a forensic anthropologist every time they have a crime scene. Not every medical legal agency can have a forensic anthropologist embedded within their actual physical structure to consult on every trauma case. In large cities with large numbers of homicides and large numbers of resources, we do see that partnership. So at the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner, for example, where I interned many, many moons ago, they have a dedicated cadre of forensic anthropologists who are embedded within the medical examiner system. They are there, 8 hours a day. They're on call on the weekends. So they're actually going to crime scenes, doing field recoveries, making maps, writing reports. They are right there at autopsy if there's any kind of skeletal trauma. That's a great system, and that works in those larger cities like New York and Houston. But many of us have to have day jobs. And so my day job, of course, my beloved day job, is as a professor at UWF. And that's my primary responsibility, is to my students, to the undergrads that I teach in classes, to the graduate students that I mentor, and research and service to my university and my community. And so academic forensic anthropologists like me, we're sort of hybrid. We have our professor self, and then we have our consulting forensic anthropologist self, who really just kind of goes into action when there is a skeletal case or a decomposed case or an unknown decedent that needs to be analyzed. So dedicated medical legal person, that's one option. Academic, hybrid, that's another. Working in a situation of human rights violations, that's a third application of forensic anthropology. And so a forensic anthropologist might work, for example, for the International Committee of the Red Cross, where they would go abroad to places that have perhaps experienced civil war, genocide, crimes against humanity, places where truth and reconciliation are necessary. And then they might actually train local members of the populace to undertake their own forensic investigations. If there are forensic anthropologists in country, they'd work with them. If not, they might create forensic anthropologists. And so these collaborative international human rights contexts for our practice are really important as well. If you are interested in that type of application, one of the most famous of those is the EAAF, the Argentine Forensic Anthropology team, who have done some amazing humanitarian work. I'm advancing my slides, and I didn't even mean to. So actually, you know what? Why don't I advance to that slide? Because another context in which forensic anthropologists work is in the resolution of historic losses of US service members during past foreign conflicts. So there are some forensic anthropologists that are actually stationed on the East Coast at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, who are working to resolve modern US losses. But the vast majority of forensic anthropologists that work with the military actually work on the historic losses, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam era losses. And these are kind of treated much more akin to a historic loss, almost like an archaeological site. And there are a lot of resources devoted to the resolution of these losses, because as you can imagine, some members of the greatest generation might not have much time left to get that case resolution, to get the remains of a loved one that has been missing for 60, 70, 80 years. And so the DPAA, I'm going to risk advancing my slides again to type this into the chat, DPAA.mil, the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency, is the government agency tasked with figuring out where these historic losses have occurred worldwide, deploying to those countries, conducting diplomacy with those countries to enable the deployments to take place, conducting excavations within those countries, utilizing help from the local populace, repatriating those remains back to the United States, and then, again, putting on your lab hat or your lab coat, if you will, doing the analyses that enable those missing service members to be identified. So DPAA, Defense, POW, and MIA Accounting Agency. And this agency is a major employer of forensic anthropologists in this country. Because like I said, it's a great mission, and there are a lot of government resources devoted to this mission. I will say before I go on, and I'm going to do a case study here, a little bit of a deep dive into the DPAA context. But before I go on, another very important sphere in which forensic anthropologists work is that of mass disasters. So in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, forensic anthropologists were there. In the wake of 9/11, forensic anthropologists were there. Forensic anthropologists were actually on site as 9/11 was occurring. And my involvement happened many, many years later, in 2007, when additional remains from the World Trade Center disaster were found in Lower Manhattan. And then essentially a whole team of forensic anthropologists and archaeologists was mobilized. Basically anybody in the New York area with an osteological skill set and the ability to conduct screening operations was employed in essentially a massive archaeological excavation of Ground Zero. So the project archaeologist made one of those archaeological provenience grids, but at a massive scale. You know, essentially Ground Zero was divided into these huge meters and meters and meters long provenience grids. But even at that scale, it enabled some really, really incredible conclusions to be drawn about why remains had remained at Ground Zero for all these years after people had thought that they had been collected. And long story short, although you can certainly look up the work of Scott Warnash, I'll put it there in the chat, if you're interested. And if you don't know about Google Scholar, I'm going to put that in the chat as well. Scholar.google.com is a great thing. It's every academic's best friend. If you type Scott Warnash into scholar.google.com, you'll probably see his work on the 9/11 recovery. But essentially, he found that in the initial response in 2000, in September, the push was to get people out, to save lives if there were any lives to be saved. And so there was this focus on clearing large debris as fast as possible and getting cranes established that could take the large debris off and hopefully get to some survivors. And so the grids that were being excavated in 2007, the grid units in Ground Zero that corresponded to where those crane platforms had been erected, those tended to be the places where small human remains got missed. Because on September 12th, 2001, people were not looking for small fragments of human remains. They were looking to save lives if they could. And so just these really, really important ramifications for mass disaster planning. Essentially, archaeologists could be included at the outset. I'm not saying archaeologists should ever run a mass disaster response. Of course not. That's going to be police departments and fire departments, emergency departments, but really, really interesting findings, really amazing, productive advancement of disaster planning and of forensic anthropology and forensic archaeology that came out of the wake of that terrible, terrible disaster. So all of these scenarios are career paths for forensic anthropologists. And which you choose really depends on your own interests and the mission that you choose to serve. Personally, I thought that once I started working at the DPAA, that was it. I was going to do that mission for the rest of my life. Many people who I love and respect are veterans. Hi, Dad, I know you're watching. And I personally do not feel that I could serve. But this was, I thought, a wonderful way to honor their service. And it is, and it was. And it was a tremendous honor working for this mission. But when I went back to grad school, I fell in love with teaching. And so now I have a new mission, and it's my students. Hi, students. I know you're watching as well. Anyway, I'd like you to explore this really, really tremendously important mission with me in the next several slides. So you see here a helicopter, Lao West Coast Helicopter Company to be specific. So this was a recovery that I did in Lao, the Lao People's Democratic Republic. And we needed helicopters because you have to understand that any sites that are unresolved from former US military losses that have remained unresolved for all these decades, they are not the most easy to access sites. They may be underwater. They may be on a cliff face. They may be spread over football fields worth of land on a mountaintop in Vietnam. So sites that were easy to process were processed back in the day when the conflict was occurring or as it was ending. So sites that we get to today on these recovery missions tend to be a little bit more remote, and it's not at all rare to see someone having to helicopter into a site or hike in or camp on a site, potentially for weeks at a time. This is the view from that same helicopter. And you can see this is a very, very picturesque riverside site, again, in the Lao People's Democratic Republic. And so the sort of sites that DPAA forensic anthropologists are tasked with processing might be an aircraft crash, might be a burial, sort of a foxhole style burial. They might be, as this case was, a last known alive location, where, for example, someone in a US aircraft saw someone in another US aircraft parachute out, but don't know if they ever ended up, did they survive the fall? Were they captured? So it's a last known alive location. It's the last place that they were seen alive. And so some of these sites are real sort of needle in a haystack type sites. Some of these sites, especially if it's a high velocity aircraft crash, are just enormous in their scope. And so again, as I discussed in the 9/11 example, we see archaeological field protocols expanded to match that scale. So you would never use a 1 meter by 1 meter grid square to excavate a Vietnam era aircraft crash. You would use a 4 meter by 4 meter grid square. 9/11, you'd use something that was even larger. And so you see the scale of the operations has to ramp up depending on the scale of the loss. And so on these sites, it's not the sort of thing that I could do with 1 or 2 grad students. And so fortunately, DPAA forensic anthropologists and archaeologists have the benefit of large teams of active duty service members that are supporting the archaeological recovery mission. And so this is something really special, that sort of this joint branches of service aspect to the recoveries, and also joint military and civilian aspect of the recoveries. You have a civilian scientist leading the team, but then you have probably 10 other military specialists, all of whom have their own task. Maybe they're an exploded ordnance disposal technician, or they're a combat camera photographer, or they are a specialist at identifying Vietnam era flight suit material. So everybody brings their own specialty to the excavation. And then again, because of the scale, we have to collaborate with local people as well. And so you see there in this image, this is a water screening operation at that same riverine site in Laos. And you can see the American team member on the left collaborating with a Lao team member on the right. So when the US government goes into places like Laos, Vietnam, Germany, Italy, the South Pacific, anywhere that the US has historically come into conflict, they liaise with the local government and they employ local people. And truly, we could not do recoveries on the scale that the DPAA does recoveries without the assistance of local workers. The goal, of course, is case resolution. The goal is finding the decedent, finding the aircraft, being able to, bring them home and reassociate them with their name and lay them to rest. But the reality is that that does not happen in every case for a variety of reasons. So the places where the US has come into conflict, places like Southeast Asia, for example, have seasonal rains and very corrosive soils. And decedents may have been in the ground for decades at this point. And so we do see the degradation, the erosion of skeletal remains in such conditions. And so it's possible to find the burial, to find the plane, and still not find the decedent. And that can be very, very difficult. But in the cases where resolution is possible, it is incredibly, incredibly rewarding. And so this is another shout out to my father here. This is an image that my father took at the funeral in Arlington National Cemetery of a friend's relative who had been lost since the Korean War. And so this individual was able to be identified and laid to rest. And so all of these contexts in which we work, each of them is incredibly important. Each of them is incredibly, it's very soul satisfying work. It's also very difficult work. In some cases, it's difficult physically, like when you're hanging off a cliff face in Vietnam. but of course it's very difficult emotionally as well. It's not a job for everyone. But for those of you who are perhaps interested in this as a career field, or if you are interested in, sharing the information that you've gotten here tonight with a friend or a loved one, if you can do it, if for some reason you have that strange combination of skeletal expertise, a strong stomach, the ability to really sort of sometimes sacrifice a bit of your personal life to resolve the case of a deceased individual, then do it. If it's for you, you will know. It is incredibly rewarding work. And it's frankly been a pleasure to share it with you tonight. So I'm going to stop sharing so that Jocelyn and I can take your questions. And I hope there are many. I love questions.
Okay, so there are many, Dr.
Wonderful.
Winburn. And the first one that pops up is, when can we apply to join the field school? Are there course
Hey!
requirements? Will there be one every summer? So shameless plug for field school, Allysha.
I knew I just had to do it. The video is so good. Our institutional communications people did such a good job. I put my email there in the chat. And honestly, it is mid-November and I cannot promise I'm going to respond quickly, but if you do want information about the field school, just send me an email. Also, if you Google Forensic Anthropology Field School, mine is one of the first things that comes up. If you put Forensic Anthropology Field School into YouTube search, you'll find that video. Share it widely. I envision building this field school so that it is basically the top forensic anthropology field school in the nation. This last year showed me that I could do it at a very large scale. 23 is a really, that's a big number for a field school. And so I think as long as interest continues, that we can keep running it at that level. And just FYI, I do accept people from outside of UWF as well. You'd basically just apply to be a non-degree seeking student here. You get the credits and then they could be applied to your institution or not if you're non-traditional and you just want to take a field school. That said, of course, UWF students do get priority. I see a comment in the chat from Jan. Thank you, Jan. Thank you for that comment.
And I will say that all of our opportunities like that, they do cost money. And so, as an institution, we rely on the support that we receive from generous donors, from grant opportunities. And so if you can't join field school yourself, but you're amazed by the work that they are doing, then also give us a call, because we need to fund these high impact opportunities for our students and members of our broader community. So I think that you kind of addressed this question, but I want to make sure that you have said all you want to say about this question. It is, what drew you to study forensic anthropology?
That's a great question. And it's great for a number of reasons, and principal among which is that there is no one career path for forensic anthropologists. People approach it from a variety of different angles. So for me, my origin story was in archaeology. I am of the pre-CSI, pre-Bones generation. I did not know this was an option. But I did know that I was interested in excavation. I knew that I was interested in the analysis of human remains. And so I got my undergrad degree in archaeology. And then I sort of thought, well, that was fascinating, but I wish that there was a way that I could apply this sort of in the here and now in a way that felt a little more, not meaningful. The work that archaeologists do is incredibly meaningful, but just a little more immediate. And I didn't know that existed essentially until the news coverage of Hurricane Katrina. And I learned about DMORTs, disaster mortuary operational response teams, which include not just forensic anthropologists, but pathologists, undertakers, radiography technicians. These are essentially little cells of people who are expert in death investigation that deploy to places where mass disasters have occurred. And I remember hearing about that and just going, this is it. Like, I was a bartender in Brooklyn, kind of trying to do like a starving actor thing, which, really was not going anywhere. And that was that was my wake up call. I applied to grad school that very fall and have never looked back. So archaeology is definitely one pathway. But, some people come to it sort of with a background in chemistry, and then they might be doing more of the high-tech analyses, like isotopic analyses. Some people come to it from cultural anthropology. You can be a forensic cultural anthropologist, and then you might be working in maybe a war-torn region, maybe working on the US-Mexico border, working to identify decedents who have perhaps passed while trying to cross the US-Mexico border. There are cultural anthropologists that are working sort of on both sides of that border, liaising with agencies on both sides and trying to get decedents identified. And so really, I don't want to say it doesn't matter what you do as an undergrad, but I think that the skills that you acquire as an undergrad in a number of different career fields can then be manipulated and sort of massaged into a forensic anthropology career. That said, there's a couple of things that I think are essential, field school being one of them. Human osteology, as many courses in human osteology as you can possibly take, being another. And generally having at some point, whether it's at the undergrad or the master's or the doctorate level, having broader anthropology theory classes. So understanding not just the tech aspects, but the broader sociocultural implications of what we do.
I'm going to follow that up because a question that I personally had when you were talking about mapping was about drawing. How do you teach drawing? Do you take drawing classes?
That's so funny. You may notice that the map that I highlighted was beautiful. The student who was drawing it was an art major. So that's not, not everybody can draw maps like Melissa can draw maps. No, I joke. But that's a wonderful question. And I don't have an answer. It's not something that is taught. And so sometimes you'll see a map that looks very realistic, and sometimes you'll see a map that doesn't. I will say that as long as the measurements are there, say for example, you took a point at the head of a femur, your thigh bone, and a point at the distal femur at the knee. You could, as long as you have those points in your map, you could get an image of a femur and pull that in to your map. If you really cannot draw, you could do it that way. But through that, the digitizing process of when you take your pen and paper map and turn it into essentially an item of graphic design, there is a lot that can be done there that can make it look neater, cleaner. And there's going to be sweat, and there's going to be dirt, and there may be decomposition fluids on your map. You're not going to submit that map to your medical legal agency. So there is an opportunity to sort of clean it up in post-production, if you will. But yeah, there's an aspect of it that it's both art and science. And so you do sometimes see people excelling in that aspect of the field work when they have a different background.
That's an interesting opportunity for potential collaboration among our faculty and our students down the road that I really had not processed until you did this presentation.
You know what else? Forensic facial approximations. I can tell you aspects of a decedent's biology, but I can't sculpt their head in clay. And so if there does need to be a forensic facial approximation made, that's another area where we do collaborate with artists.
So interesting. Okay, so another question that we have is, how might a degree in psychology benefit the field of forensic anthropology?
Immensely. For a couple of reasons. And one is that until relatively recently, forensic anthropologists sort of liked to believe that we were very, very objective about the work that we do. I am a scientist. I can separate myself from my case. I can separate my emotions from the case that I'm doing. If someone has given me prior knowledge about the case, that won't influence me, that won't bias me. Say I do the recovery and I see that the decedent is wearing like US woman gendered clothes. That won't bias me to think that they are female. No, I can with just sheer force of will, I can eliminate those biases. Well, psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists have shown us that that is just not true. And so there is a whole burgeoning field within the last several decades, but really sort of very new within forensic anthropology specifically, about cognitive bias and the ability for those expectations and experiences and theories that we've acquired during our training to color the way that we analyze a case. So I would very much value collaborators in psychology, because I can see it, I can observe that bias exists. In fact, one of my grad students, I was hoping there would be an opportunity for me to plug her paper, because her paper is for the next 2 weeks totally free. For those of you that don't know, there are paywalls often for the public, so it's a bit more difficult for you to access academic articles. But because this article is so cool, it's been taken out from behind its paywall for the next 2 weeks. So that link should take you to an article about cognitive bias, written by one of my grad students and me and a cognitive neuroscientist collaborator in the UK. Anyway, we found that even measurement analyses, even metric analyses, were able to be biased by contextual case data. So I really think having a psychology background would be a boon. I also think, in light of all of those difficulties that I highlighted, particularly emotional difficulties, mental health is something that is not widely talked about in this field. It is definitely an area that we need to be talking about. We deserve self-care as well. It can't just be about decedents. It has to be about practitioner health as well. And we tend to de-emphasize it. There's almost like a machismo to being a forensic anthropologist. If you acknowledge that you let a case in, then you are less of a good analyst. And I think all of that is probably detrimental to our mental health and to our overall health. And again, another very productive potential psychology overlap.
So this is really a related question. I'm going to skip to it because it is very much related to what you're talking about. How did you, or do you, build and maintain the mental and emotional fortitude in preparation for this sensitive work?
Thank you, first of all, just for acknowledging that. You don't, it's hopefully you have a good social network, and I do not mean social networking. I mean my field is particular in that it is very small. Everybody knows everybody. That certifying body that Dr. Evans mentioned at the beginning, the ABFA, there's only maybe 150 people who are diplomates of that in the world. There's maybe only 500 forensic anthropology practitioners in the nation. And so on the one side of that coin is it's competitive, but on the flip side of that coin is once you find your people, they are your people for life. And so I would say having my constant ongoing text stream of fellow forensic anthropologists who know exactly what experiences I'm going through, being able to bounce ideas off of them, having a community, especially in absence of a real focus on mental health within the field, just being able to build your own community that sustains you has been sustaining. And some people sort of develop coping mechanisms where they are able to turn it off. Some people are able to be very, work is work and life is life. But in reality, I think ultimately that does catch up with you. And so I also have the luxury of I don't work in a medical examiner's office. I am a professor. I get to see living, healthy people on the daily. And then, maybe I'm doing 6 cases a year. So I do have the luxury of letting it in a little bit more because of the nature of my casework. I think if you were working in a medical examiner's office, you'd have to develop a totally different coping strategy. But regardless, the community has been absolutely vital in terms of my own coping.
On the other end, what's been the most rewarding part of your fieldwork to date?
Oh my, I don't know how to explain forensic anthropology casework other than it is like, it's almost like Zen practice. Like when I am doing a case, it is like, clarity through movement type of, when I'm doing my measurements, when I am taking my notes, when I'm doing my report, when I'm taking my photographs, it is a time for me to just be very, very focused on the case at hand, and kind of let that become my reality. And that can be a really rewarding experience. We put so much of yourself, so much of your focus into a case, and then it gets resolved. That in and of itself can be very rewarding. I also will say one of the most rewarding things that I wish I got to do very recently was the medical examiner's office was going out on a recovery, and they were collaborating with law enforcement, and it was happening now, and now was 7 p.m. and I have a 4-year-old, and I said, can it wait till morning? And they said no. And so I said, give me a moment. And I called my 2 highly trained field technicians, and I said, will you go and augment this field recovery? No pressure to lead it, but will you go and will you be my representative? And they both said yes. And Jocelyn, watching them drive away, like with their gear in their truck, was like, I made my own colleagues that day, and it was like nothing I've ever felt. So that was like just one of the most rewarding things that I've ever experienced. Like I looked at my husband and I'm like, that just happened. Like, there they go. There go my colleagues. So that's, one of the blessings of being able to do that hybrid form. So you can see I let it in, like no poker face here. No objectivity, nor neutrality. But yeah, that's, there can be intense satisfaction from both interactions with the living and with the case decedents. Also, working on recoveries with law enforcement, I find very, very, very satisfying. Sometimes they go for days and days and days. And there is a sense of camaraderie that is developed on those recoveries. You're in adverse circumstances, often not pleasant at all. And those experiences can also be very rewarding. And at the end of the day, hopefully you bring somebody home.
So you talked a little bit about the recent trends in ethics concerning the treatment of bones, skeletal remains. What protocols do you see in place that protect dignity and respect for human remains?
Well, if you do not value dignity and respect for human remains, then you should be in a different career field. But that being said, there are few actual, like, on the book legal protocols that address this specifically. And so most of our ethical codes in forensic anthropology tend to be about the ethics of, like, don't falsify data, be a good scientist, use methods that allow you to constrain those cognitive biases, be honest in your reporting, and of course, be ethical in your treatment of the remains. But I do perceive a movement within the field where that's not enough for people anymore. And so I do, there are committees that are starting that they're just getting off the ground now, that are looking at, for example, the ethics of curating forensic remains. If someone is unidentified, can you teach with them? They're not consenting. That is, their family members were not able to consent. They were not able to consent. Can you use them as an educational model? 20 years ago, most forensic anthropologists would have said yes. But all you have to do is look up the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia and the firestorm between the Penn Museum and the Philadelphia public to know that that's not good enough anymore. We cannot just teach with forensic remains. We cannot just display forensic remains. And so a lot of us have moved to only showing cast remains in our research publications, in our teaching. But there's no single federal law, for example, that governs whether I can include a case decedent in an academic paper. And so in the state of Florida, the Dale Earnhardt legislation holds that you cannot show autopsy photos outside of a courtroom context. And so skeletal remains are considered autopsy photos. So in the state of Florida, that's clear. Can I show human remains in a case report that I want to publish? Heck no. Unless I have explicit permission from the family members of the decedent. But that's just Florida. And so it totally, you do see forensic case decedents published in academic research. And there's a lot of people who are really kind of giving that a good hard think right now. Some really, really cool research that is coming out that I just had the pleasure of reading from my colleague, Dr. Crystal Latham. It is looking specifically at this, and she's one of my co-authors. Again, I never have the opportunity to really share academic articles with non-academics, so I highlighted a couple of open access ones that I was hoping I could drop into the chat, and this is a perfect opportunity to share this one. Anyway, Dr. Latham is one of my co-authors on this piece, along with several other like-minded individuals, and that one's also free. But in it, we call for a more robust code of ethics that deals not just with these issues of testimony and honesty and data integrity, but also like actual integrity, like how what happens when I conduct myself unethically with regards to another practitioner. Nothing, because that's not in most of our ethical codes. What happens when I publish a case decedent? Nothing, because we haven't codified that. So I'm really glad that somebody asked that, because I think that, if I were to give this talk 10 years from now, my answer will probably be a lot different.
Okay, and one more question. And this is about development in the field. How have advancement in technology, such as computer modeling software, higher processor speeds, 3D printing, how have those developments and advancements affected your work?
Interesting. Well, in terms of like statistics and computing, we could not do the analyses that we do without them. And so we've really sort of seen the fluorescence of our field as, in many science and social science disciplines, as those technologies were developed. 3D printing, I would say, doesn't really impact my casework, but in terms of my research, showing a 3D printed set of remains rather than actual remains could be potentially more ethical. I have heard medical examiners say that if they have a 3D printed model of a skull with trauma, that is more frequently allowed into the courtroom as evidence, rather than a potentially very gruesome autopsy photo of that same skull. So I think that has probably impacted medical examiner casework perhaps more than me. But just tech more broadly, I would say chemical analyses have really revitalized the field. Portable X-ray fluorescence to measure elemental compositions of bones. That's really important, perhaps if we're trying to tease out whether something actually is bone or whether it's not. Isotopic analyses, which allow us to access the elements that were incorporated into bones and teeth during their actual formation. So we can know a little bit about essentially the bedrock composition of the place where somebody grew up based on the water they were drinking, or even, the water that mom is drinking, if it's a tooth that formed while that person was in utero. So we can sort of tell a bit about someone's movement across the landscape if, for example, their teeth tell a different story than their bones. Because once your teeth are created, they're basically just little rocks in your head. They are mineral. They're like 98% mineral. And so they do not remodel throughout your life, but your bone does. So if your teeth say that you grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania, guilty as charged, and your bones say that you live in Northwest Florida, and you are found in Southern California, that can really inform the investigation of your case. So, that case investigator would know, I'm not looking for a local person. I'm looking for someone who has traveled first from this region of the country and then to this, and then, so in terms of like narrowing down that universe of possible matching missing persons, that investigator knows that they have to go more broad. So all of these things have been really amazing technological advancement, technological, and just general scientific advancements that, that pathway to be like an isotopic forensic anthropologist, that exists now, whereas it didn't 20 years ago.
Well, Dr. Winburn, this was amazing. I want to thank you from our dean's office, but also I want to take a minute to tell everybody what we have coming up. So I've had the pleasure of working on programming for this lecture series for many years, probably a decade. And I've been given the opportunity to work over the last few years with support from our UWF Office of Equity and Diversity and the John C. Pace Symposium Series. And we use events like this to highlight the importance of the liberal arts, social sciences to contemporary society, bringing diverse voices to our community and showcasing the wonderful work of our faculty and our students. So the attendance tonight was wonderful. We thank you so much for registering. It's one of our most successful virtual events that we've had. In the spring, we plan to create a number of experiences, and I want to highlight them. You'll hear more. We'll send you all the information you need. But we plan first to create an immersive experiential event on the use of labyrinths throughout history for religious, meditative, and ritualistic purposes. That one will be led by our historian, Dr. Marie-Therese Champagne. Then we're going to try to host a common read of Art Spiegelman's graphic novel, Mouse, and host him virtually to join us to speak on this work. And then we hope to host in person Jad Abumrad, who's the creator of NPR's premier podcast, Radio Lab. We're really excited about that one, and we hope you'll join us. We'll send you all the details you need, so don't worry. But from all of us at UWF, we thank you for coming, and please have a wonderful evening. Very good night.